on this episode of The Sages, we delve into the rich, multifaceted life of a writer of an excellent nature, Professor Nuruddin Farah. Prof, you're welcome to Sages. I hope you are doing well.
I'm doing well, thank you.
I mean, it's a privilege to have you join us this afternoon. Let's start by exploring those early influences and literary background. Can you describe how your upbringing, which was with a father who was an interpreter and a mother who was an oral poet, how did they influence your decision to become a poet, sir?
Well, I was very lucky to have a wonderful mother who looked after me quite well, and not only me, but also a number of children. My mother was an oral poet. Unfortunately, I did not become a poet. I became a novelist. And I think one of the things that have stayed with me up to now is how serious she was about composing poetry, oral poetry. Because one of the things she did was she always insisted on having silence around her. And she would walk pace back and forth as she composed the poems. And as a child, I looked at her, watched her, studied her movements, and thought maybe one day, I would be able to do something similar to what she is doing. There was discipline to what she did. She had given birth to 11 children. And looking after a big house, my father's house and family, and making sure that everybody was in a good spirit, that food was on the table at the time when we came back from school. These are things that have stayed with me all these years because it required discipline. And I learned discipline from her. Thank you.
Now, that sounds interesting. I mean, the child of an oral poet and becomes a novelist. Would you say this is right through the bloodstream? You inherited your competency in writing from your mother predominantly?
Well, I think to become an oral poet is obviously very different from becoming a novelist, someone who writes one novel after another. But basically, she gave me the help I needed as a young person.
Okay.
To think what I would do with my time. My mother, even though she was a poet, was not literate in the sense in which we understand the word. My mother did not know how to read and write. But she was literate in the African sense of the term, and contributed to orature in her own way, because basically she was what you would call a community poet. She didn't have the time required to compose poetry often, because she had to look after 11 children and a big house with a large family.
For you, how was, yes, I thought I actually interrupted you there, but I just wanted to find out, how was growing up in that large family, in that big house, like for you? What are the memories that you still reminisce today with nostalgic feelings?
Well, not only was the family large, but also my father, who, when he received his pay severance from the British colonial government and then moved to a small town on the river of Shabelle River, a small town called Kalafo, presently in the Somali region of Ethiopia. My father had a general store, and there were many nomads who came on a weekly basis to make purchases from his shop. One of the conditions was that there will be lots and lots of nomads with their camels and cattle and goats who would tie these beasts that were for sale in our compound. And therefore, there was a great deal of movement in the compound in which I grew up, in addition to or on top of the young boys and girls of the family. There was a great hustle and bustle in that household, which I benefited from as a writer eventually when I started writing. So I was always interested in what these nomads who came to our town were doing, because they brought their camels to sell. They brought, and then when they wanted to purchase sugar and flour and various other necessities, they went to my father's general store and bought things from him, which is why he allowed them to come and stay in our compound for the 2-3 days they were in the town. It was very interesting to listen to them tell each other stories. It was also very interesting for me to ask them questions. I was what you would call at that time a town boy or a city boy, and didn't know anything about nomads and how they lived. Never looked after a camel in my entire life, although I'm a Somali.
Oh, interesting.
So these were interesting things that would eventually become handy.
Now, let me bring in these teenage experiences that you started hinting of. Now, the Ogaden Rebellion, you escaped it. How did all of that shape your thoughts, your understanding, and your appreciation of the conflict between specifically Somalia and Ethiopia?
Well, obviously, I was influenced by what was happening to the people amongst whom I was growing up. I was brought up to think of myself as a colonial. I was brought up to think that Ethiopia, or rather the government of Haile Selassie, dominated our lives tyrannically, dictatorially. And then when the war between Somalia and Ethiopia occurred, first in 1963, we left the Somali-speaking part of Ethiopia and moved to Mogadishu, Somalia, in order for me to pursue and complete my education. There was no possibility of life's comforts in Ethiopia for a Somali child, Somali young boy, growing up in that area at that time, because Haile Selassie's regime was very brutal. And I recall my older brother, being imprisoned. And so I would sometimes be asked to take food to my brother in prison.
Wow.
Simply because he had visited Mogadishu in order to receive education, which is not available for a Somali in the Ethiopia of the day. So these are some of the sad histories that I remember and about which I have written. There is a novel of mine called Maps, which is about the conflict between Somalia and Ethiopia in 1977. A conflict that claimed nearly 2 million lives, Ethiopians and Somalis. Because because Somalis felt that that they suffered under the regime of Haile Selassie at that time.
Okay. Wow. I'll be exploring the conflict in Somaliland, and I would be interested in talking about whether you think there is a proxy war happening on Somaliland currently. But let me switch up this conversation to the point where I bring in the time you spent in India, studying in India. I mean, what led you to choose India of all places to study?
Well, soon after leaving Ethiopia, and going to Somalia, it took me a year and a half to finish my high school, after which I was offered a scholarship to 2 different countries. I was offered a scholarship to go to the US and to study journalism and literature at the University of Wisconsin, Madison.
Okay.
And there was also the possibility of me going to India to study philosophy, Indian philosophy, and literature. And I chose to go to India because I felt I was not ready at the age of 19, 20 to go to America, fearful that I would be so influenced by America and its ways that I would return home and think with a big head and, begin to despise everyone. I was interested in Indian philosophy. I was interested in Hinduism and Buddhism at the moment. And when I decided to go to India rather than to America, nearly everybody thought I would never become a writer if I went to India.
Okay.
And therefore tried to do the best I could to make sure I became a writer and to make sure I understood the world better, first through Indian contact with the non-European, non-American world, and to expose myself to India, where the situation is not so very different from Africa. Because the India of the early 1970s was not really as developed as India is today.
Okay.
So I was inspired. The stories that I heard and listened to when I went to India inspired me a great deal. I doubt very much if I would have written the first couple of novels that I've written if I had gone to America instead of India.
That's interesting perspective there. Now, because you talk about inspiration, I was going to ask you, how did the Indian experience actually affect yourself as a writer? But tell us more about this inspiration you got from India to be able to deliver the first set of books.
Well, India is a very, very large, diverse country. And in some of the areas I lived in the north of India, in the Punjab. The questions I asked my classmates, the questions I asked the parents of my classmates, the people I met, these were questions that were very close to the questions I might have asked if I had continued to go to university in Somalia. India was also, there's a large Muslim community in India as well, unlike America at that time. So I could go to some of these places and learn from them and listen to the stories that people were telling each other. And some of the writers, contemporary Indian writers who were writing at the time, were putting similar questions to themselves about colonialism, about the history of their country, in the same way as I was asking myself questions that I needed answers for.
Okay.
So these were the things that inspired my life, and the reason, I was a a post-colonial child. You see, Somalia became independent when I was about 14, 15. And therefore, the questions that Indian writers were asking themselves at that time were really not different from the questions Africans were asking themselves.
Now, in 1970, you published From a Crooked Rib, and I've read reviews about that. Some of them even suggest that it's one of the cornerstones of modern East African literature today. I mean, that's some of the things that many have said about that. Is this Indian inspiration that led to that? Because the story is really about Ebla, a young woman who flees from her nomadic life in the Ogaden after her grandfather offers her in marriage to an old man in exchange for some camels. Are you saying that without the Indian experience, you would have gotten the inspiration to write this all-important novel that perhaps is one of the biggest products that you produced?
Well, it's too difficult for me to imagine what my life would have been like if I had lived anywhere else other than India at that time. Obviously, the story is based on a young Somali woman. But the inspiration came from my contacts in India when I was writing the novel. There's no doubt about that. If I had lived in Somalia when I was writing that novel would have been different, maybe more sociological than the text that I published later.
Okay, that sounds...
It's very difficult to point out. It's very difficult to point out the seeds of inspiration in such a specific way that I should be able to say more things about it now. This is 52 years ago.
Yes, a lot of it. And it's very profound. And you keep hearing a lot more people giving it extraordinary comments and remarks, even though this was published as far back as the 1970s. Now, permit me to proceed on this same line. You had said before this very important quote. When you said truth is often stranger than fiction, what exactly did you mean by that?
Well, I don't know if I'm the one who said that. I think. Well, let's go back to From a Crooked Rib, for example. When the book came out, that novel was never reviewed in the first 10 years of its existence.
Really?
It was never reviewed in its 10 years of existence. And it made impressions on readers, mostly in Africa, to the extent where the word about it traveled by word of mouth. People continued telling one another, this is a good novel to read. There were a number of incidents that I can remember. That, for example, there was a secondary school for girls in Tanzania. And the school library had one copy of From a Crooked Rib. A young Tanzanian girl, borrowed the book from the library. And because at that time, if a student borrowed a book and lost it, the student would be asked to pay 2 shillings to replace the book, and the library would buy another copy. And so it happened that one girl discovered that her friend kept the book rather than returning it, and then paid the 2 shilling that was a fine. Another girl did the same, and another girl did the same, until the students must have borrowed and stolen or kept about 4 copies of Crooked Drip. The principal of the girls' school wrote to me, care of my publisher, and I sent them 15 copies, and the 15 copies ended up in the libraries of some of the female teachers at that particular school. So it was a kind of novel that girls growing up liked to borrow and then keep. There are many other stories about Crooked Drip, including one time when the book was translated into Slovenian, and a Slovenian woman wrote to me a letter addressing me as Mrs. Farah.
Oh, I
because
see.
I was a woman. So the book had its own stories, many stories to tell.
That's interesting. Some have said you have the penchant to place truth at the center of fiction. Is it true?
Well, that depends on what the readers find as truth in the texts that I publish. I cannot claim this to be the case. I can only try the best I can to write the best I can. It's the reader who determines whether there is truth in what I write. Because everybody finds a different truth.
That's interesting. But even if the truth is hidden in plain sight, and of course, I'm basically referencing one of the titles of your books and novels, Hiding in Plain Sight. Really, what has been the motivation for that?
The motivation for what?
Hiding in plain sight.
Well, it so happened that in 2014, I wrote a draft of a novel of mine called Hiding in Plain Sight, about a young Somali man who works for the United Nations. He was originally Somali, but now is coming from Canada because he fled during the civil war in Somalia and ended up in Canada, became a national, applied for a job with the UN, and he was sent to Somalia to help the United Nations offices move from Nairobi, where they are often located, because Nairobi is more peaceful than civil war Mogadishu. This young Somali whose name is R, with 2 children, was asked to go and work in Somalia. This man was killed by a Shabab in Mogadishu. It just so happened I finished that novel, draft of that novel, and did not even submit it to my editors, publishers, when my sister, who was working in Afghanistan, but working for for UNICEF, was killed by the terrorists,
Wow.
Taliban in Afghanistan. And I had great doubts whether or not I had foretold my sister's death by writing the novel Hiding in Plain Sight.
Wow.
So, I was quite sad and did not know whether to publish the novel or not for a while. Anyhow, life imitated art. My sister was killed by Taliban. The character in the novel was killed by another terrorist group in Somalia, Shabab. That's where, quite sad.
That's very sad. Now,
Yeah.
was it your intention, has it always been your intention to keep Somaliland prominent in global literature through books? And how do you feel about achieving this?
Well, writing is a job that I do like anyone else. Some people go to their offices in the morning and then come back at 5. Writing is a job that I do from 9 in the morning until 5, nearly every day if I'm healthy. And therefore, what happens as a consequence of what I write when people read it is something of which I have no control. I would say that my attempt is to continue feeling safe and working hard as best as I can every day. Otherwise, I might go mad. There are 24 hours a day, and one has to fill these 24 hours. And I find that one of the ways of filling these 24 hours is to fill them with inspired writing about the lives of Somalis mainly, even though more recently, I have finished the draft of a novel set in Cape Town. The first time I have set a book in Cape Town in which I have now lived for 25 years.
Interesting. Is it the beginning of a transition of focus?
I doubt it very much if it's the beginning of a transition, but all my novels involve Somalis of one kind or another. And lately I have been writing about Somalis who live in different parts of the globe. And this new novel, which I've just finished a draft of, is the third part of a trilogy which began with a novel called Hiding in Plain Sight, followed by another novel called North of Dawn, which is set in Oslo, Norway. And the third sequel of the novel is is called Karmic Debt, and is set in Cape Town. So it is about Somalis in the diaspora and their lives and how well or how badly they're doing.
Wow. How then do you think some of your writings, for example, A Naked Needle, got people upset and perhaps led to your exile?
Well, A Naked Needle was a satirical novel, is a satirical novel. And it was about, I set it in the first early years of the civil war in Somalia, of the dictatorship in Somalia when Siad Barre came to power.
Okay.
And it is about the dictatorship, the corrupt dictatorship of Siad Barre, who did not like the novel and who threatened me with imprisonment if I returned to Somalia. But I was naive at the time because I thought that the novel was about a young Somali who studied in England and who promised his girlfriend that he would go ahead of her back to Mogadishu and he will allow her to come back to join him after setting up a home in Somalia. But I think the novel was read by Siad Barre and his cronies as being very critical about his regime. And he promised me 30 years of imprisonment if I returned to Somalia, which is what it led to my exile. And I haven't been back. I did not go back to Somalia for 22 years.
Wow.
I left Somalia in 1974 and did not return to Somalia until 1996, in the midst of the civil war.
Talk of war, do you think Somalia is a battleground for proxy wars?
Yes, I think because of the location that, Somalia, the country, strategic location, many countries are interested in Somalia, and they cannot keep their hands off Somalia, whether it is Americans, Chinese, the British, and principally the Arabs, who continue interfering in the internal affairs of the country. Some of the Arab countries have also contributed to the continued support and existence of the Shabab terrorists. So I think, in a way, it's a sad country, tragic in all its manifestations, because it's a poor country with natural resources as yet unexploited. But peace is very elusive because of the continued interference from outside by external forces, some very powerful forces and some evil forces that are there.
Now, the understanding some have put to this is that the proliferation of weapons after the Cold War and subsequent attempts in a similar path were part of the reasons why the conflict really has not really abated in Somalia.
No, that's not the case.
From what you
The
say,
reason why Somalia has not regained peace is because of this external interference from so many countries. There are about 12 countries that have a hand in the continued strife in Somalia. 12.
12.
Ethiopia is one of them.
Uh-huh.
The Arab countries are one of them.
Okay.
The Europe, China, and so on and so forth. If these people keep out of Somalia and the affairs of Somalia, the country would probably return to peace eventually.
But exactly what are they doing to drive the ongoing conflict?
Well, they want to control the country, and the only way to control the country is to make sure that peace is never born, that peace has no chance of developing.
But how can Somalis cultivate a desire for peaceful coexistence?
Well, Somalis are listening to the advice of some of these external forces. A number of politicians play lip service when speaking, but what they do is that they work in the service of their paymasters, whether they are, foreign paymasters. The United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and some of these countries are also involved in making sure that Somalia never regains peace.
How about the international community? Have we done enough to actually help Somalia?
Not yet enough. Not enough. Not yet.
What more can we do?
Well, there's very little you can do because until the Somalis wake up to their own responsibility, no one can help the Somalis have to get their act together and reunite. That's the only thing one can hope and the only thing that would save it from continued self-destruction.
And is there hope for a Somali future?
There is hope. There is hope because, a country can't remain in a doldrum forever, ever, and ever.
Now, do you still consider yourself as somebody who's in exile? And what do you miss about Somalia?
Well, I miss Somalia because I miss the food, I miss the people, I miss the possibility of, walking in the streets of Mogadishu and finding comfort in living there. But that possibility has been elusive. I can't go back because I'm now used to living outside. I'm now used to peace. Yeah.
Now, let me broaden the conversation to a bit of what's happening on the continent. As a distinguished senior African writer, what's your perspective on Pan-Africanism today?
Of what?
Pan-Africanism, the movement today.
That is a sentiment that's still alive, the Pan-African sentiment. And you can tell it when someone like me travels anywhere in Africa. The moment you tell people you are from Somalia, ordinary people welcome you, governments avoid you.
Interesting.
That is one way of looking at Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism is in the people, not in the corrupt governments. Whether you come to South Africa, the people in South Africa are generally, very warm towards Africans, but the government could be bureaucratic about who comes in and who goes away. The fact that a European does not need a visa to come in here, that other Africans need visas. The fact that, for example, a country like Tanzania would insist that a Ghanaian, if he wants to come to Tanzania, would require several months before he or she can be issued with a visa. The fact that it's very difficult to travel in Africa. The fact that flights between African countries are more expensive than, anywhere else in the world. All these things are in the way of Pan-Africanism becoming a reality.
Is there hope for the future? When you speak to young people, do you get the impression that continental African unity, Pan-Africanism of the people is real and is going to be promoted and projected in the coming years?
Well, one can only hope. And I hope every day that young Africans will one day help the continent to reunite. And I thank you very much for all this. I think we are done, are we?
Finally, I wanted to ask you about African literature, where it's heading, as a way of final words from you, sir.
Well, African literature is abundantly strong now. There are a number of powerful, strong, young female writers that are coming out of Africa. I can think of a number of young men and women, Africans, who are doing a great job, a number of whom have benefited from having lived both in Africa and Europe, and who are producing great works of literature.
I am most grateful to you, sir, for your time this day, and we wish you all the very best. And I'm hoping that one of these days you come to the Republic of Ghana. We'll be glad to receive you.
Thank you. Well, I was in Ghana recently for the funeral of Amahata Haidu.
Oh, yes.
Who is a friend of mine.
Okay.
We already miss her.
Certainly, we do.
In her place have come lots of other young writers, some of whom are female, some men. And I wish them and you and everyone else all the best. And I thank you, sir.
I thank you also too. And folks, that was distinguished writer and scholar, Professor Nuruddin Farah there. Many thanks to you for watching.